The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. Yeah!
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to go over some common salt problems or salt pool issues that you run into. I'll just list one problem and then I'll list the possible solution. So I think you'll find this a pretty easy to use guide on your saltwater pool troubleshooting. If you have a problem with your saltwater pool, this probably would be a pretty good reference for you, and I'll cover some of the more common problems. Pool Service Pro, open a Leslie's wholesale account today and receive wholesale pricing on products you use every day. Leslie's Pool Supply offers convenient locations that are open 7 days a week. Another great benefit of opening a Leslie's wholesale account is Leslie's referral program. Get referred to a customer looking for weekly pool service. Save time and money and grow your pool service route and become a Leslie's Pro. This one's relatively common, and it's sometimes harder to take care of on your own than you think for a couple of reasons, but the dirty cell indicator, a lot of different systems have a flashing light when the salt cell gets some calcium buildup on there. For example, the Hayward Aquarite will have a yellow light flashing in the inspect cell area of the control panel. Now, this is something that you should know, that every 90 days, the inspect cell light will come on and flash because it's programmed in there just to kind of give you a heads up that, hey, you should be checking your salt cell. It may not be the salt cell is dirty, actually, and you can reset this light by holding the diagnostic button down for 3 to 5 seconds, and that should turn that flashing yellow light off. However, it could indicate that the salt cell is actually dirty, and I really don't like the fact that it has this program in there, but you can take the cell off and inspect it. Now, what I meant by sometimes it's hard to actually do this, sometimes the unions are on a little crooked. You know, when you're plumbing one of these in, it may not be perfectly straight. And so a lot of times the biggest struggle with cleaning a dirty salt cell is actually getting it off and cleaning it. So sometimes the unions are really hard to remove. Sometimes they're super easy if it's installed correctly. But I've had several accounts where getting the salt cell off is just a bear. And you can, there's different ways of trying to get it off without breaking the union. Some people use those straps when you remove the oil filters. I personally like using a large pair of channel locks. You get them at Home Depot. They're like gigantic with the blue handle. Sometimes 2 pairs, one holding the cell in place while I turn the union. However, you want to put a rag on there because you'll tear that union up pretty quickly with the channel locks. So I always put a wet rag over it, and that way I don't tear into it. But that's one problem. So if you do get a dirty cell indicator, remove the cell from the plumbing. Sometimes if you're fortunate to have a cell that has a clear top like the Jandy True Clear, you can actually see the calcium buildup in there. A lot of times, with the Pentair and Hayward cells, you can't, so you have to take it off and then just inspect the cell. Now the Hayward is a little harder because it has the white plastic in there, so it's hard to tell if there's calcium sometimes, but usually you can see the calcium. And then you want to refer to the manual of your salt system. You can pull down the PDF manual and see what the acid to water ratio is for your salt system. They're all different. For example, the Jandy True Clear is 1 part acid for every 10 parts of water, and you may have different acid to water mixtures. Some require you to put a cap on there and then fill the cell with the water acid mixture. Others you just put in the bucket of water. So it's just a matter of what cell you have, and each manual will have the cell cleaning specifically written out there for you. So I recommend cleaning the cell as the manufacturer recommends with the recommended dosage, because if you use too much acid, and in the industry we use 31.45% muriatic acid. If you get it at Home Depot, it's somewhere around 15% muriatic acid. So it's weaker, and so kind of do that number and try to, figure out the best acid to water ratio. Note that the muriatic acid will have some smell to it, even diluted in water. And you also want to add the acid to water if you're diluting it. I think the safest way to do this is to get Acid Magic. You could buy a gallon of this, and it has a really long shelf life. I think it's like 3 or 4 years as a shelf life. And it's hydrochloric acid, so it doesn't really have any fumes. And it has the same strength as 31.45% muriatic acid, but it's a safe and effective way to clean the cell. So give it a bath in the water acid mixture, leave it for as long as the manufacturer recommends. Usually it's somewhere around 10 minutes. And then you want to rinse it out. And you also want to use, I wouldn't use a pressure washer of any kind, but maybe like a high pressure nozzle to spray the cell plates down to make sure you get all the calcium off of there. Sometimes it breaks off once the water flows over it. And then put it back on to the equipment. And again, sometimes that's the hardest part, getting the unions lined up. There's an O-ring in the unions, or usually there's an O-ring that's there that you can see visibly, and you want to make sure that's intact and, lube it up if you need to. And that's mainly where you're going to have water leaking when you put the cell back on. Many times I put the salt cell back on, turned on the equipment, and then water shoots out of the unions, and I'm like, oh man, I take it apart again, lube it up. I'll even change the O-ring in some cases. You want to, of course, have spare O-rings if you do pool service. And yes, the cell being dirty or having calcium buildup is a very common problem, probably the most common problem with the salt systems. Depending on your area, you have more buildup than others. Sometimes you can go 6 months without cleaning them. There's really no specific time. In my area, usually every 2 or 3 months, we're taking them off the unions and cleaning the cells. Other areas like parts of Florida where the water is much softer, you can go 6 months, some 9 months without having to worry about it. But it is something that technically is simple to do, but there are some hurdles and there are some things you need to make sure you do correctly. And the main thing is the acid to water ratio for your particular salt cell to make sure that you're not overdoing it and damaging that cell. And of course, getting it on and off. I went through some of the trouble that you may have with that. But realistically, if you're having a lot of trouble getting it on and off, you may just want to replumb the whole thing. And I've had to do that a few times. Next would be a no flow indicator of the cell. This is a pretty common problem, no flow, because the cell has a built-in safety mechanism, and if there's no water flowing over it, it could get really hot and it could actually explode. And I've seen pictures on, the Facebook groups of like salt cells that exploded. So the flow is important, and if there's no flow, it won't activate and it won't, the plates will not, of course, create chlorine. And so the no flow light is important. Now in the Hayward Alkyrite, it sounds like I'm picking on Hayward, but a lot of the problems that are pretty obvious are the Hayward Alkyrite system. They have a flow meter that's the flow sensor, I should say, is detached. It's a little black knob that threads into the plumbing. So if you have a Hayward Alkyrite, you're going to see a little black half-inch kind of, almost looks like a hex nut, and it's going to have a little wire in it, and that's the flow sensor for the Hayward Alkyrite. A lot of times, rodents will chew that wire. I've had gardeners, trip on it and break it. It's really a flimsy little black wire that's connected to the flow sensor, so it's easy to break. And again, if that's not connected or if there's a tear in it, it's going to interfere with the flow sensor and it's going to show no flow. And there's a little arrow on there, like a microscopic arrow that indicates which direction to actually install the flow sensor. So I've seen pools before where they're actually installed at the wrong angle from the builder when they put a new build in. So make sure that arrow is lined up to the return and you're fine, you're good to go. Replacing that's easy, just unscrews, unthreads, and then you plug it into the controller with a phone jack kind of end on the other end. Other times the flow is because you have a variable speed pump and you have it set too low as far as the RPMs. Typically, most salt systems require at least 1800 RPMs, which would be a medium speed. And in some cases, if you don't have RPMs, you have percentages. You would probably want to have it at 50% in order to get flow. And initially, when they start up, the flow light will be flashing anyway for maybe up to 2 or 3 minutes as it initiates. So if you have no flow when you first start it, it may disappear after a couple minutes once it gets enough flow and it goes through the safety time period that's preset in that system itself. So the no flow indicator may not be a problem. It just may be happening when it starts up. And it may also be because you have the variable speed pump set too low. Now the Pentair IntelliChlor and the iChlor cells had a defective flow sensor on a lot of units. Some of this was covered by warranty by Pentair. They snap on the front of the salt cells. If you look at the PDF diagram, you'll see the flow sensor snaps onto the front of the cell. And they had a run of some defective flow sensors a few years back So you may have run into a bad flow sensor there. You may have a Pentair cell with a bad flow sensor, and you can just replace that. So there are some manufacturer defects as well. But the flow sensor, of course, is critical because if there's no flow and the cell starts to produce, it is going to cause the cell to overheat and potentially explode. And the no flow could be for a number of reasons. And I think that's something that you can investigate with your particular system. And of course, in the manual, it'll have reasons why that system has no flow displayed, and it has corrective actions for your specific salt system. They're all a little bit different. Another common issue is if your system displays high salt or low salt. And I'll touch on the high salt real quick, and I'll also touch on the low salt in a minute. High salt is pretty common, especially if you have cleaned the salt cell. And a lot of times the Pentair and Hayward systems will flash high salt. And you're wondering, well, what's going on here? I just cleaned the salt cell, and now it's getting high salt. I think it has to do, and I'm not really specifically knowledgeable about why this happens, but I will assume that the sensors are sensitive, and once the salt cell is clean and everything is functioning, after a few minutes it'll reset itself, and what happens is probably it's getting a very accurate reading or more accurate reading of the salt level in the pool. And a lot of times there is high salt in the pool because you may have added salt to the pool because you were getting a low salt indicator, or maybe there was no chlorine holding in the pool. And a lot of times the systems, if you have it connected to an automated panel, it'll tell you the salt level, but that's not quite as accurate, in my opinion, as a digital salinity meter that also compensates for water temperature. And I would say get a good digital salinity meter like the Hawk meter or the Lamont one. These are really good. Or the Okaton. These are all good salinity meters that will give you the actual salt level. So before you add salt to the pool, I would always, even if it shows low salt, I would always check it with a separate digital salinity meter, and I would not rely on the system or what the lights are indicating on the system itself. Sometimes when the salt cell is getting old, like with the Hayward Aquarite system, you're going to get a low salt indicator when the salt level may be perfectly fine. And I can't tell you how many pools I've taken over with the Hayward Aquarite systems, and I put my digital meter in there to test the salt level, and it's at 6,000 parts per million because the customer or the previous pool service kept adding salt because the system kept saying that the salt was low in the pool. And that was mainly because the salt cell was old and it wasn't reading the right levels because the age of the cell was just not functioning properly. And you would add salt and it would work for a week or two. And then you would add more salt and it would work for a week or two. And by then, when you put the new cell on, you're going to get a high salt indicator because the salt level is like double what it should be in that pool. So be very careful with the high salt reading or the high salt indicator on a cell, because it may be true, especially after you clean the cell, and it may have too much salt in the pool because of a previous error of adding too much salt, trying to correct the problem of low salt. And this kind of touches on the low salt issue that I mentioned, but specifically for low salt, a lot of the systems will read low salt when the salt cell gets dirty or when the salt cell starts to get old. Sometimes if the salt cell is dirty, you're going to get a low salt reading. So the first thing I usually do is when I take over an account, I'll clean the salt cell, I'll put everything back, and I'll wait a few minutes for it to kind of reset itself. Usually they start booting up and reset in 3 to 4 minutes. And then if it flashes high salt, usually, the salt level is high. And I also test the salinity or salt level in the water with my digital meter. And if it's coming in at like 4,500 parts per million, most systems will of course go to the high salt indicator at that point, because a lot of them don't operate really well over 4,000 parts per million. Most will want 3,000 to 3,500 parts per million. And if you go over a certain amount, it's going to flash the high salt. So a lot of times the low salt indicator is because the cell's old, or the cell is dirty, or of course there is low salt in the water. And there's no way to know this unless you have a separate digital salinity meter, so you can dip it in there, get the salt reading, and know for yourself if, for instance, the salt level is coming at 2,700 parts per million. Well then yes, it is low for that system, and that's why it's flashing low salt. Add a bag or two depending on the pool size. Again, don't overdo it. Make sure you know the pool size and how much salt to add for that pool size. bring the salt level up. You may not get the system to read the correct salt level while you're there because it takes a while for the salt to dissolve. So the next week you come back, you'll test it again, or maybe a couple days later, and that'll give you the salinity level. And usually the system is all green lights by then. So yes, it may have a low salt, it may have a dirty cell or an older cell, but you definitely want to verify that with a digital salinity meter. If the salt level is high at 4,500 parts per million, then I would simply do a partial drain to drain out 2 feet of water or 1 foot of water, depending on how big the pool is, and then add fresh water. That will dilute the salt, and then usually the system is all green lights at that point. So how do you cure high salt? You drain some of the water. How do you cure low salt? If it truly is low salt, you add salt to the pool, and you want to use, of course, only pool salt. You can get it at Home Depot or your local pool store and add that to the pool. Another common problem is that the chlorine level is at like 20 parts per million when you test it, which is of course high in the pool, and you want to lower that down. One of the things that is kind of strange is that if you just put a new salt system in and you maybe were using tablets or liquid chlorine, you'll find that the saltwater generator is highly effective and efficient, depending of course on the salt cell and the size of the system. You'll find that it adds chlorine to the pool at a much higher level and a much more consistent level than you are adding it manually with liquid chlorine tablets, Cal Hypo, whatever you're using. The salt system is much more effective. It's basically a chlorine factory right at your equipment pad, and it's going to make pure chlorine and add it to the pool. And if you have the output set at 100%, and let's say you run your pool for 18 hours a day, you're going to add like a pound of chlorine in most cases to the pool. And if you're adding a pound of chlorine a day, by day 4 or 5, you're going to be at 20 parts per million of free chlorine. So here is where something that, is not talked about much when you buy the salt system, but it is something that's really crucial, and that's getting the output set to a certain percentage that is going to be effective and not over chlorinating, and getting a certain runtime for your pool so the system is not producing too much chlorine. And this is something that's very difficult to do in a lot of cases. You have variable speed pumps running, at different speeds for different amounts of time, and you have different salt cells based on, the cell rated for the gallons. I'll give you just a quick example. Let's say you have a 15,000 gallon pool and you have a Pentair IC40, which is rated for 40,000 gallons, and you have it at 100% output, and you have your pool running. I'm going to keep it simple and say you just have a single speed pump running for 12 hours a day. Well, that's going to produce about half a pound of chlorine a day in your pool, which for a 15,000 gallon pool is too much. And so what you're going to have to do is either reduce the runtime of your pool. So let's say you bring it down to 8 hours and you have it at 100% output, then you're going to probably produce maybe 1/4 of a pound of chlorine. And by the way, if you go to the salt system PDF manual, it'll tell you in there per your salt cell size how many pounds of chlorine are added to the pool based on it running 24 hours a day with a single speed pump. And of course, all these numbers I'm throwing out to you are just guesstimates because, if you have the IC40 running for 24 hours and it has a single speed pump, it would produce 1.4 pounds of chlorine. And so, of course, if you run it for 12 hours, you're going to get half a pound or a little bit more than half a pound of chlorine in the pool. So this is something that's difficult because you have to adjust the runtime and the output. So a lot of times the easiest way to reduce the high chlorine in the pool, let's say you test your water and you're at 15 parts per million, sometimes you can't even get over 10 parts per million with some testers. So be careful there too, because it may show 10 parts per million, but you may actually be at 20. But the best way to adjust this is with the output. So if you're at 100% and you're getting way too much chlorine, you can keep your pump running the same as it has been running. Don't adjust that. Just turn the output down to 40%, and then check the chlorine level the next week and see where you're at, or the next few days you can check it. It may take a while for it to drop down from being at 15 or 20 parts per million, so it's going to be hard to adjust that if it's really high. You may just want to turn the system off for 2 or 3 days and let the chlorine level drop, and then kind of readjust it. But the output is the best way to adjust how much chlorine. Basically how the output works, if you have it at 100%, that means that the salt cell is producing chlorine. That hour is going to be producing chlorine continuously for that hour. If you have it at 50%, then that salt cell is on for half an hour and off for half an hour. If you have it at 25%, it's only going to be on for maybe 20 minutes of that hour. And that's how it adjusts the production. It's not that it kind of turns down the output. It just turns off. It doesn't produce chlorine for that period of time. And then if you have, again, at 100% output, it'll produce chlorine continuously for that hour. And that's why when you have like the superchlorinate or the, a button on there that allows it to kind of chlorinate the pool after a party, it's really not turning anything. It's not producing more chlorine. It's just putting it to 100% output at that point. So if you have your system set at 50%, you have a pool party, and you want to superchlorinate the pool, hitting that button will not make the cell produce more chlorine. It just puts the output at 100% for a period of time, so it produces more chlorine that way, if that makes sense. And of course, the same as far as low chlorine. Now, there's a lot of different factors why it may not be producing chlorine, and I probably can't go into all those. That would be like a whole separate podcast of why a salt cell is not producing chlorine, and I actually do have one on that, or a couple on that. But basically, if it's not producing enough chlorine, you would want to set the output to 100%, and then check all the different things that I would go over in a separate podcast. Cyanuric acid level, the pool runtime, if the cell is clean, if there's any kind of red indicator lights on your system, all of those will make it so that the salt cell is not producing. And I probably should have said this when I talked about cleaning the cell at the beginning, but if you have a dirty salt cell light indicator on, if the Pentair light is flashing, clean cell, basically your salt cell is not producing chlorine at that point because the system is not activating the cell because it says the cell is dirty. So just be aware that if you do have a flashing check cell, dirty cell light, there's no chlorine being produced at that time because the system is saying that the cell is dirty and it's not going to create the chlorine that you need. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons that the chlorine level is low in the pool, is that the salt system is not producing chlorine because the salt cell is dirty. And I can, of course, go over a bunch of them, but I would talk for another 20 minutes. But I think this gives you a good idea of troubleshooting certain things that you may run into with your salt system. And of course, this doesn't cover everything that can go wrong, but it covers the more common issues that I run into out there with the saltwater systems on my pool route. If you're looking for other podcasts I've recorded, you can find those on my website, swimmingprolearning.com. Just click on the podcast icon at the top, and then it'll have a drop-down menu of over 1,400 podcasts for you. And if you're interested in a coaching program that I offer, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. Real quick, if you're not using pool service software, try Skimmer free for 30 days at getskimmer.com/poolguy. Again, that's getskimmer.com/poolguy. Skimmer, everything you need to run your pool service business all in one app. Pool Service Pro, open a Leslie's wholesale account today and receive wholesale pricing on products you use every day. Leslie's Pool Supply offers convenient locations that are open 7 days a week. Another great benefit of opening a Leslie's wholesale account is Leslie's referral program. Get referred to a customer looking for weekly pool service. Save time and money and grow your pool service route and become a Leslie's Pro.